10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
Siła, forma, dyscyplina. Białko, kreatynę i kolagen marki All Nutrition znajdziesz w sklepie SFD. Z kodem 0 zgarnij 10% rabatu.
Partnerem programu jest aplikacja inwestycyjna XTB. XTB. Tu pracują Twoje pieniądze.
W kolejnym odcinku Ground Zero witają Państwa Raymond Andrzejczak
i Sławomir Dębski.
Gościmy w Muzeum Powstania Warszawskiego w pięknej sali pod Liberatorem. Bardzo serdecznie dziękujemy za gościnę dyrektorowi Muzeum Jankowi Ołdakowskiemu, ale także Oli Dudzie, która pomogła to wszystko zorganizować. A naszym specjalnym gościem jest dzisiaj Roger Moorhouse. Przechodzimy w tej chwili na angielski, abyśmy mogli
make it life easier.
Make it easier. So it's almost well, the great opportunity, a fantastic pleasure, Roger, to have you in our show. Welcome.
Thank you, Sławek.
And the topic of our conversation today would be the Poland's role in World War II and how it is remembered and how it should be remembered. Roger Moorhouse, apart of the fact that he's our good friend for many, many years, he's a fantastic writer specializing on World War II history, Tetrite, but also his professional journey brought him to Poland and to Polish historical context. So I brought with me 3 books of yours. So I'm going to introduce them, and through them introduce you. Devil Alliance in Poland. In Polish, it was translated as labeled as a Hitler-Stalin Pact.
No, it's Pact
Diabłów. Pact Diabłów. So Hitler's pact with Stalin, 1939-1941. So that was, I think, your first book related to the kind of the Polish fate during the World War II.
Yes and no. The very first book that I wrote, which I co-wrote with Norman Davies, was Microcosm in English. Which came out a long time ago now, 2001. So obviously there's a lot of Polish history in that. My initial task in that actually was to do more the German side. So Norman, as you know, brilliant historian, has numerous languages. He doesn't have German. So that's where I sort of fitted into the equation.
Norman Davies is very well known in this room,
of course,
in these venues. He wrote a fantastic book about Warsaw Uprising. We'll come back to that because it was fantastic in the way that it brought the issue, it brought the story to the English audience. So next book I would like to show to all of you and to our viewers. Polska 1939. Pierwsi przeciwko Hitlerowi. And I loved English title more. Poland First to Fight. It has a backstory as well, so we will talk about it later. That, but you followed Norman Davies' path, and you brought September 1939 Polish story to the wider global audience. And last but not least, Paszporty Życia, Forgers in English. So it is a story about Holocaust, but to be more precise, it's a story about the Polish diplomats trying to
In Switzerland.
rescue European Jews.
Yep.
Not only Polish ones, but more broadly. So we will talk about it later. But as an introduction, I think it's a good.
Perfect.
So as we are going to talk about World War II, I think the first the subject for our conversation should be, well, is it still relevant to remember World War II? How it is remembered in the United Kingdom, and actually, where is Poland in this big picture?
I'm reasonably optimistic about this aspect, actually, generally. I think the sort of death of memory, if you like, is one of those things that has been much foreseen and predicted and little in evidence. And I think the reason, certainly in Britain, and I suspect in the Polish case as well, I think the reason for the endurance of that sort of collective fascination with World War II is partly to do with the fact, every nation needs to have what political scientists like to call a sort of, a usable history. And in many ways, that usable history is the thing that sort of tells you who you are, where you've come from, what you as a nation stand for. And in both the Polish and the British cases, and in a perverse way, the German as well, the German sense of identity is also very tied up with World War II, but in the opposite sense. In all of those cases, it's tied up with World War II, the experience of it, what the nation did, what it achieved, and that is not really going away as the generations sort of recede. I mean, was it 2 weeks ago, I think we lost the very last Battle of Britain pilot, died at the age of, I think, 104. So we are down to, almost the sort of the very last. I mean, I remember a couple of decades ago, we went through the same experience of the very last First World War veterans dying off. And there was a big sort of soul searching in the media and so on about when the last one of them died. Where does this leave us? Where does this leave memory of World War I and so on? We're going to be going through that process with World War II fairly soon. But as I say, I'm actually quite optimistic because I think it's so well anchored in the collective memory and in the collective sense of Britain and sense of itself. That it's not going anywhere anytime soon. So, World War II is still an essential part of the national, furniture, and in terms of cinema, in terms of best-selling books, in terms of, it's part of everybody's world, even if, our direct connection to it is fairly soon going to die off. And I suspect, arguably all the more so in the Polish case, given the sort of horrors of Poland's, the searing horrors of Poland's wartime experience, I imagine that that's probably the same case in Poland as well. That World War II as a collective narrative is not going anywhere, in short order. It's gonna still be very present in Polish discourse.
So, well, if I may, just before we go to details, as a soldier, because I still feel, my soldier's mind, I got to ask, one question. Last time we've met, there was a British Army Museum, which was a beautiful place, and now I'm really happy that we are here in Warsaw Uprising with lovely RAF bomber, anyway, P-24. Every nation has some kind of emotional approach to certain historical, events. Poles are a little bit unique. So for me, as a soldier, but also as a Polish, it's always difficult to differentiate between very much emotional, sometimes even romantic approach to certain, historical. Every single Poles we say about the Squadron 303. From a historical point of view, we know they shut down 126, the Luftwaffe airplane, losing only, 8 pilots, being the best squadron in the Battle of Britain. But in the same time, in a very much scientific, using science for you as historian, the scale of effort, Squadron 303 in entire, air campaign is You can find out in numbers. So today, for you, do you still think that we are too much romantic, too much emotional approaching to the history, or should we be much more pragmatic and mathematical, I would say? How you see them?
Yeah, it's funny. I actually gave a talk last week at the what used to be the Polish Officers Club in London, Ognisko, which I know you know very well. I'm sure you do as well, Raymond. And again, it was a sort of an audience of broadly Polonia, you know, sort of you know, the sons and daughters of that generation, essentially. And the thing that you notice when speaking about Polish history, and particularly as an outsider, I mean, I don't have Polish blood, I don't have Polish connections in that, family connections. But the thing you notice as an outsider is that passion that you're talking about. And it's the old line, I forget who said it, you know, that one Pole is a charmer, two Poles is a fight, you know, or two Poles is three opinions, or whichever line it was.
That's true.
But you see that, like, I'll be there, and it was rather like today. I was being interviewed, and we had an audience, and there was genuine passion in the room in the Q&A session, you know, and you don't get that. For example, I mean, as I said, I sort of crossed the tracks between doing a bit of Polish history and doing German history as well. And when I do German history, even in Germany, the reaction is extremely cool, because that's how they view it. This is not a passionate thing. This is an extremely, you know, cold, almost scientific subject, history. And you can see that in the way history is written as well. You know, the Germans are very sort of scientific about it. For example, I think the Poles are slightly in the same tradition of viewing it almost as viewing history as a branch of science, of Wissenschaft, as the Germans would say. The British history writing tradition, is much more, you know, viewing history as a branch of the arts, as a branch of literature. And that's where, actually, coming back to your point, that's where the passion can come in, right? So a good book, I would say, a good and particularly popular history, you want to be able to rouse that passion and use, you know, passionate accounts, evocative accounts, to pull your reader into that world. So actually, you can use that to your advantage, you know, very, very effectively. So there is a broader question here in terms of how, you know, if we're talking about how we spread knowledge of Polish history abroad, you know, beyond the circles of Polonia, which is a challenge, admittedly. But if we're talking about how to do that, then I think sometimes that passion becomes counterproductive to some extent, because it feels, you know, certainly to a British audience, we're all frightfully reserved. And to some extent, it's like, it's all too emotional. You know, just take it down a notch or two. So that sort of reaction. But in general, I mean, that it is a challenge to sort of spread the word, because I think you have, you know, I have the feeling when you know, you imagine a reader at the bookshelves in a bookshop, and I think most readers, I mean, I'm not like that, but then I'm odd. But most readers, I think, go through the shelves and they say, "Oh, there's another book on the Dam Busters, for example," and they will say, "Well, I've read 6 books about the Dam Busters, so I'll read that one." Okay, I would go the other way. I would go for something that I haven't read about before, and I think this is where Poland tends to fall between the cracks. So unless you can kind of drag people into that Polish world in a different way, then it is a challenge.
So it looks like to achieve the target or objective to bring, you know, wider knowledge about the Polish history, we should change a little bit of tactics of, you know, delivering message.
I wouldn't necessarily advise changing tactics. I think the passion, I find that passion I find it quite exciting. I find it quite charming. I prefer it, even though if you're in a sort of a public event and the audience starts having an argument with itself, that can be slightly difficult. But I'd rather that than, in a sense, the German example, which is the other extreme, where everything is absolutely sort of cold and neutral, and you're not allowed to show a passion in a way.
But that's actually the moment when you start, mentioning bookstores and walking around the bookshelves. That's exactly the moment I would like to introduce a kind of an anecdote, because perhaps the audience don't know, but we are hosting today an author who is spectacularly good at bringing this Polish passion, bringing this Polish history to the wider global audience. So I visited the library of West Point another day. Yeah, we were together at the West Point a couple of years ago, and there was a Polish shelf in this library. So I went there, and there was two of your books. Out of I don't know 12 about Polish history. I think there was two Norman Davies books and two of yours. Then in Harvard, there was another occasion. I went to the library. Library is a good orientation point if you want to grasp what's people interest. And again, Norman Davies and Roger Mulhouse were telling the students of Harvard about Poland, about Polish history. So
That's your special responsibility.
so you Roger, so you are particularly good at that, telling people, wider global audience about Poland, about the Polish experience of World War II. How are you doing that? So what's your
wish I
recipe
knew.
for success? How, if you can you share with us, I mean, with the Polish audience advice how to do that?
That's a very good question. I think it's a combination of, on the one hand, I am an outsider, so when I look at that history, I am reasonably dispassionate, and yet combined with that, at the same time, I am quite passionate in that I find it fascinating, and I always have. It's a kind of this actually predates my professional relationship with Norman Davies. I had this a weird fascination with Poland, going back to Lech Wałęsa and Solidarność and all of that period. So combination of passion and a dispassionate approach, I suppose. I also really love the writing experience and the whole process. So I think that's a key thing with particularly popular history. If you want people to read it, it has to be worth reading. And I think that's to some extent a problem. I think many of those who are maybe interested in Polish history, it's a rare skill set, right? This is what we've talked about this with colleagues of mine. It's a rare skill set to find someone that can do the research and have, take on board sort of different perspectives and so on, and do the sort of the hard work of the historian, and at the same time can actually write, can actually formulate that into a compelling narrative and a decent structure that sort of makes sense to a reader. So it is quite a rare skill set in that respect. And I really enjoy the writing side of things, and creating something that is hopefully compelling, and even more hopefully is historically accurate as well. And that a lot of that I have to lay at Norman's door as well. Norman was I had what I always describe as essentially an old-fashioned apprenticeship with Norman. I sort of pitched up as a third-year student at London University, and really by chance, fell within his orbit. He asked me to do some work for him, which I wasn't going to turn down. And I worked with him and for him on his next probably 4 books for the best part of 10 years, very closely. And the reason I say that was an apprenticeship is that we covered everything, the whole historian's art, everything from dealing with the press and dealing with agents and dealing with publishers, to research, writing, engaging research assistants when you need to, and so on, And the whole writing process, like we wrote together, we wrote Microcosm together and literally used to bounce text. This was late 90s, so a lot of it went by fax, believe it or not. But we used to bounce text between us. And I would get sort of, not many red pen episodes, but I used to get red pen in the margin saying, why are you trying to do it like this? Why don't you do it this way? And it's a brilliant education as an author, and nobody gets that. You don't receive that education. No one teaches you how to write in the world. But I had that from Norman. So I'm delighted you say all those nice things, Sławek. But I do have to lay a lot of that on Norman. Norman, it was a tremendous experience to have that.
Well, 1939, which is extremely interesting that you are interested in such a piece of history of Poland. But still, even today, when I'm going somewhere and I still hear the myths of the Polish army from 1939, which was not necessarily undeveloped or well organized. More or less, Polish army comparing to another armies in Europe was in the same standards, except German army, which was that time absolutely top army in the Europe or even in the globe. And even today, I hear the myths about the Polish cavalry, the charges, German tanks with the sabers, all of the things makes me crazy as a cavalry officer. But from your perspective, you have a pretty big time window. So if you compare those myths, let's say 10 or 20 years ago, and today, is it any change, any dynamics that some important things influence a little bit? And what's your perspective?
Yeah, I think it is shifting actually. So I mean, there's a wider issue here about awareness of Poland and Polish history at all in the outside world. And we were talking earlier on that there's a sort of a common Polish, I would say, neurosis that the outside world doesn't know, doesn't care, and in some extreme cases there's a belief that it's all a big conspiracy to do down Poland. It's really not that exotic.
Some of them well grounded.
Yeah, okay. But I think it's just it comes back to Chamberlain's famous line about Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
These are far away places of which we know little. And for many people, and you make that point about 20 years. 20 years is very significant. 20 years ago, that still was the dominant sort of model, if you like. This was a faraway place about which most Britons knew very little and were interested even less, if they're honest. Apart from strange creatures like me and also Norman Davies. So in the meantime, there has been a massive shift, and this is largely to do with EU accession. We have large Polish minority in Britain now, and there's a generation of ordinary Brits who might pick up a history book because they get one at Christmas, and for them now, Poland is not just some faraway place about which they know nothing. They've got a Polish neighbour, right? And they maybe they've been to Warsaw for the weekend, or they've been to Krakow or whatever. We're connected in a way that we weren't 20 years ago. So I think there has been a shift. And that's what I think to some extent made it sort of fertile ground for that book. Because as I said, I think it's very important in terms of spreading the word to get beyond the sort of finite reach of Polonia. You can write books for the Polonia market, whether it's in the UK or the US or beyond, but those are the main ones. But it's a fairly finite market. You're preaching to the choir to a large extent because they know all this stuff, most of them. And the key thing, I think, is to try and get beyond that and try and get beyond to the people who read, Anthony Beevor, Andrew Roberts, and so on, and have a genuine interest in World War II, but wouldn't necessarily know anything about Poland. So I kind of see, in a sense, that was how I saw my own task, was to sort of grab those readers who might have picked up my previous books, maybe Berlin at War, on the German experience in Berlin, Killing Hitler, which came out before that, to grab the readers that have read those books and say, look, if you thought that was good, come with me on this Polish adventure. And I'm trying to drag a new readership into that Polish world. So those sort of aspects together, I think there was a fertile ground for that book. And it was a really important change of perspective as well, because where 1939 had been written about at all, and it really hadn't been written about much. Generally the 1939 campaign, in those sort of, imagine those big histories like Beaver's single volume on World War II, for example, Max Hastings and so on.
There was only one book, I think, written for the British audience about September 1910.
Yeah, but I mean the sort of the single volume on World War II, right? Which a generation of fathers and grandfathers got for Christmas. That sort of book. It will have 4 pages on the September campaign on Poland 39. 3.5 of those pages will be about the British agony, political and otherwise, about the prospect of going to war again. And Poland, if it's mentioned at all in terms of what Poland experienced in September 39, would probably be from the German perspective, because they'd used Guderian's memoirs, right? So I saw there's a massive story here which is completely not being told in the English-speaking narrative. So not just to explain the story of that campaign, that 5-week campaign, which is pretty momentous, and in terms of death toll is right up there with various other campaigns that get all sorts of treatment in history books, and 1 volume on the Ardennes campaign or whatever it is. So it fully deserves that treatment. But then beyond that, to also tell it from a Polish perspective, to flip the perspective and say, what was it like for the Poles? What did they think they were doing? What did they expect from the British? What was it like for civilians under German bombing? What was it like for those that experienced the Soviet invasion, which also, in the English-speaking narrative, has been airbrushed out? Hardly talked about at all.
Missing element, yeah.
Yeah. So I wanted to do all of that, flip the perspective, bring that Soviet invasion right back front center into the narrative. So I was kind of trying to do a lot, but I think it kind of worked.
But you had this, or you still have this kind of the interest in individual experience of people. So you write your books trying to bring to the wider audience particular individuals behind the big history.
Yeah.
So why did you decide that the story of Capitan Raginis was particularly appealing for the British or the wider audience?
Yeah.
What actually brought you into this personal story of Raginis?
I think when you're dealing with these big stories, as we are, it has to be humanized. You have to humanize it to make the readership understand what's going on. You have to bring in a human element, and that doesn't mean over emoting, but I think it has to have that human element. And another crucial thing, you alluded to it as well, Raymond, is this. One other thing that I always have in the back of my mind to try and do is to challenge mythologies. There's nothing I hate more than mythology, and you've got a great example in the cavalry against tanks myth. I've tried very hard to finally put that to bed.
Which is perfect German propaganda.
Of course it is, exactly. So I go into in the book I go into where the myth came from and how it was sort of propagated as German propaganda. And again, the sort of instances where you had, a Polish attack on infantry, for example, which is then counterattacked by tanks, and hence, the idea arises that it was a foolish Polish attack on tanks. So I tried to really pull that apart to get rid of that myth, because a Polish friend of mine, when I was writing that book, Polish friend of mine in the UK, who has kids the same age as mine. And she's not interested in history at all, to be fair. But she did once say to me, my son was teased in the schoolyard about cavalry against tanks. And she was going, what the hell is this? Why is that being thrown at him in the schoolyard? And I thought, I was already writing the book, and I thought, I've got to try and kill this thing off because it's ridiculous. And actually, you mentioned Raginis, Władysław Raginis. I mean, he's another. That's actually an example of a bit of Polish mythology. You know, the idea of the sort of, you know, the Wisna, Battle of Wisna, the modern Polish Thermopylae and all that sort of thing. I can see why Poland is kind of developing heroic mythology, and that's not to run down Raginis, because, you know, what he did was heroic. But the idea of it as a sort of Thermopylae-like battle is just not realistic. It's just not true. And as soon as you look at other accounts, you look at what the Germans thought they were doing at Wisna, the whole thing begins to fall apart, right? So again, I try and be a bit more gentle, perhaps, with Raginis and Wisna. It is also a great story. But to go back to your point, it's got to be human. It's got to be, you know, the story has got to be humanized to sort of bring the readers in.
So typical British approach, not like a German, you know, writer. I don't want to ask you about Enigma from some reasons, because my sister, she lives in England and having a British husband, so we have a family discussion who really broke, you know, the codes of Enigma. So that's the different. But this is another important topic. Still, I think and I believe dynamic, which is alliances. And of course, big discussion in Poland is very important today because we have a situation in Ukraine. Credibility of alliances. So is it any change in understanding a little bit skeptical approach of Poles? What will happen? I mean, Polish and Great Britain and France, the alliances before war. Is it any change, or you think it's still the same misunderstanding?
There is another Polish myth
Yeah.
about Polish being betrayed.
Okay, but the question.
Yeah, I think. Well, there are numerous betrayals, I would say. I think 39. I talk about that in the book quite extensively. I think 39 can be construed as a betrayal. As much as anything, it was a misalignment of expectations. That's the fundamental problem. The British and the French never had the capacity to project their power to Eastern Europe. They didn't have the aircraft. They couldn't sail up the Baltic. It was not possible. So, and the expectation, not necessarily amongst, you know, Polish experts and general staff and politicians and so on, but certainly amongst the people, was that the British and the French were coming. It's okay, the British and the French are coming. And yeah, there's even instances, you know, probably apocryphal, but there we are, where ordinary Polish civilians in a village somewhere see the tanks coming into the village and say, "Oh, thank God the British are here," and then they realise they're Germans. I mean, oh God, right, okay, different narrative. But that's quite an even if it is apocryphal, it's quite illuminating of the popular opinion that they genuinely thought the British were coming to their aid. Of course, they never were. The best that we could do, British and the French collectively, was to sort of poke at Western Germany, you know, with the Saar campaign in the French example, with some rather desultory bombing of military targets in the British example, to try and, if you like, draw away some military hardware, military units from the Polish frontier, and to bring home the reality of war to German civilians and others. It was never going to work. And on top of that, there was a lack of will to make it work. You know, the British were quite willing to bomb naval targets, you know, places like Wilhelmshaven and others.
Which was technically, operationally possible that time.
Yeah, it was operationally possible. They could have bombed the Ruhr, they could have bombed Hamburg in 39, but they didn't. They dropped leaflets, but they didn't drop bombs. So the political will was not there to actually, you know, make war with genuine vigor.
Still, I think, you know, we can, I think, judge the situation in 1939 and the British and French decision to go to war against Nazi Germany in September 1939 differently now. When we are seeing or deliberating or considering what we should do towards Ukraine. And there is a public debate both in Poland and in Europe whether, you know, some troops should be sent there, and of course, you know, the public is overwhelmingly against it. So just 20 years after a very painful and costly in human lives war against Germany, French and the British decided to go to war against Germany again. I think that was incredible.
I agree.
think that
I
was
agree.
incredible.
And this is why I sort of temper my criticism of the British and the French. And it's not because I'm British, believe it or not. But I do temper that criticism. But I do describe it as a betrayal. But at the same time, I temper it because, a real betrayal would have been Britain and France faced with, a situation where they couldn't actually really influence the theatre itself, i.e., the German invasion of Poland. And they just got to throw their arms up and say, well, sorry, guys, you're on your own. They didn't do that. They did actually honor the treaties. They did actually declare war.
To their word. Yes.
Yeah, they stuck to their word. Even if it was just their word that they fought with, which is a fair comment, but they did at least declare war, and that meant, a long-term engagement against Germany, which, in the British case, bankrupted Britain. Britain lost the empire, was bankrupted, was a small rainy island off the coast of the European continent at the end of it.
And then decided
so we
go Brexit.
Yeah. So there's a lot there that we have to unpack when we talk about this question of betrayal. But from a Polish perspective, the perception was in '39, we're fine. Where the British and French are on side, we're going to be okay. We've got these allies. And where the betrayal does come in as well, I would say, is where there's that inter-allied meeting at Abbeville, which is middle of September, and the allied staffs, the British and the French staffs, basically get together and say, Poland's lost. We can't influence this campaign. So what we're going to do is actually, husband our own forces. And the French say the same thing. So the Tsar campaign has failed, although it's only half-hearted anyway, but it's essentially failed. And both parties, British and French, say, we're going to husband our own forces to make sure that we're able to resist a German attack when it comes, which is fair enough strategically, but they didn't tell the Poles. So the Poles are still expecting help at the end of September.
So it requires some additional work in both sides to understand the meaning of alliances and expectations. So still important. When I discuss, especially among the historians and also among the soldiers, it's pretty well known. 1939, there was Narvik in Norway, and there was Tobruk in Africa, Battle of Britain, of course, the 1st Armored Division, General Maciek, and then Monte Cassino, 2nd Corps. But this is one thing which is absolutely unique when you compare it to other countries, which is underground army, Armia Krajowa, and the effort scale, absolutely unique in Europe. The biggest army, well organized politically and also militarily, with the finally very important confrontation, which was the Warsaw Uprising in the place we are here today. So how well it is known in the UK or in the western part, scale and the uniqueness of underground army?
Sadly, nowhere near well enough. I must be honest. As I said, we've been on a journey, as we like to say these days. Particularly the last 20 years, I think there's much greater awareness, as I said, of Polish issues, Polish history, where Poland is on the map, for a start. And there have been some sort of salient moments in that. I think you mentioned Norman's book on, Rising 44. I think that prior to that, even amongst people that read history books, which is a kind of pretty self-selecting group anyway, but even amongst people that read history books, there was still profound confusion between the Warsaw Ghetto Rising of 43 and the Warsaw Rising of 1944 in that world, outside of Poland. Norman, in that book, which I worked on as well, I think put that confusion to bed. He put the Warsaw Rising on the map, as it were. But still, again, this museum does a great job, and I know that I'm sure there are lots of British visitors here, and absolutely to be welcomed, and more should come. But there's still that sort of fundamental problem of it being a faraway place of which we know little. And in the British case, we have this, there's a weird narrative here where we are fascinated by, and I would even say that we kind of fetishize the French resistance. And it's partly geographic, proximity, obviously.
Or maybe because of movies. I mean,
Yeah.
alone.
Yeah, exactly. That's where I was going. So then you've got, for my generation growing up, we had Secret Army, which was this kind of drama, which was all about SOE and, sending agents into France and all that sort of thing. And then we had this comedy, which sort of slapstick comedy, LOLO, which ran through the 1980s, which is just about, René, who runs a French cafe, and he's got resistance people, running out of the kitchen, and the waitress is linked to the runaway British airmen and all this. I mean, it's comical. It was very funny, but it shows you that's our mental furniture as far as resistance is concerned, was France, and it kind of always has been. That needs to change, and I think we need to, because as you said, Poland's resistance is way larger, more effective, more organized than the French resistance was. This is one of those areas, and it's one that honestly I would love to write about at some point, is to do the history of the Polish underground and try and do the same job as with this book and try and bring it to a wider audience. So I'd love to do that, but knowledge of that is still unfortunately rather lacking.
I think that is, coming back to this comparison between Poland and France, I think 1940 is particularly illuminating moment in British history. And actually, after the defeat of France, the Poles and Poland became a second largest army fighting with the Nazi Germany, way ahead of French. If I well remember, a couple of thousand troops came together with de Gaulle in summer 1940 to the islands. And this story is not well delivered to the wider audience. That still not only Polish pilots, but Polish Navy, a lot of Polish troops. For more than 1 year, United Kingdom was fighting with Poland, together with Poland against Germany alone.
Yes. Well, it's an interesting point. This alone thing, we have that. That's part of the British narrative.
Yes.
1940 alone.
Yes.
And there's a wonderful, I think it was a David Lowe cartoon, which is, if I remember rightly, was sort of outline of the southeast of England, and there's Churchill looking like a bulldog, with his fists on his hips like that, and it says very well alone. Right, this is after the fall of France, and it summed up the mental attitude at the time. But of course, again, it's another myth. I mean, Britain wasn't alone. Even in 1940, we had the Empire, right, and we had Poland. So we lost France. Okay, France was lost. We had some Free French troops and so on. We still had Poland, and we still had the Empire. So you've got all of those Empire troops: Australians, New Zealanders, South Africans, Canadians. So the list goes on. So this idea of us being alone in 1940 is simply not true. And that Polish element is really interesting because it was recognized very clearly at the time that the Poles were among us and were on our side and were helping and so on. And you can see it from, there's these mood reports that the Home Office were running, where they had sort of what are basically informants who would write in on a monthly basis and talk about the conversations they heard in the pub. I know it sounds a bit kind of Gestapo-esque, but that was how, the British government kept a handle on the public mood. Nobody was arrested on the basis of those conversations. They were just sort of sent up as a sort of a help to government opinion. And the archive of those documents is all in the University of Sussex, right? It's a really interesting archive. And you can see from that the first sort of two years of the war up until 41, there's tremendous positivity about the Poles. You know, they were seen as exotic, for one thing. Polish airmen, you know, if you were a young woman in Britain in 1940, if you could bag yourself a Polish airman, ooh, you're like, this is, you know, really, really impressive stuff, because they were so gallant. They
Tom Cruise,
they kissed hands.
Top Gun.
You know, all of that, yeah, exactly. You know, this was as good as it got. And and RAF pilots were frightfully jealous of these Polish pilots as well. So there's that element, and you see that coming through. So they're very popular, they're very effective. Battle of Britain, of course, 303 Squadron has the highest kill rate in the Battle of Britain. Poles are there, as you said, at Narvik, you know, Tobruk, the list goes on. Battle of the Atlantic, they're there. So absolutely, you know, by Britain's side, and it's recognised at the time that this is the case. And the problem with this narrative is that then 1941 happens. German invasion of the Soviet Union, and Britain goes, and Churchill leads the way on this, goes all out to bring the Soviets on side, because he knows, and it's a very cynical move, but you can completely understand.
Definition of strategy.
Of course.
Yep.
You know, I remember there's an account that I read, and I think it's in The Devil's Alliance, of Churchill waking up on the morning of the 22nd of June in Chequers, and you know, being presented with
going drunk.
Well, he had whiskey for breakfast that morning, but he essentially does a little jig. You know, we're off the hook because they've gone east. This is brilliant, and he says the first thing we have to do is make sure they stay in the fight, right? Because there was a perception that the Soviet Union was so rickety, so badly damaged by the purges, that, you know, it wouldn't last more. I think the official estimate of the British intelligence was it would last about 5 weeks. Of course, we know that it lasted a damn sight longer than that. But crucial for Churchill was to pull out all the stops to make sure they stayed in the fight, which meant Lend-Lease, which meant rolling out the red carpet for Uncle Joe, all of that stuff. And in the process of all of that, and of course a propaganda effort to essentially whitewash the Soviet Union, right? All of that meant that the Poles fell through the cracks, right? Because not only were they second string to our new glorious Soviet allies, you've got the Americans coming in 41 as well. The American airmen replaced the Polish airmen as the, you know, the bow of choice. And then on top of that, the Poles increasingly, you go forward to 43, discovery of the Katyn graves, for example, the Poles and the Polish government in exile increasingly take on the role, as far as the British are concerned, of being serial disturbers of the peace. These are the guys that are actually causing trouble in this grand alliance that we have to keep going. So there's an obvious moment where the British government basically kind of jettisons the Poles and says, because we have to keep the Soviets on side. Strategic necessity.
That's a definition of strategy. I'm just asking myself when I watching everyday's news from Ukraine, some analogies will be pretty close. Well, so Poland was also unique because Polish soldiers, they were fighting in all fronts, Europe, North Africa, Atlantic, and even in the Far East, as well as the biggest resistance movement in Europe. We had no state at that time, which was also very much unique because there was no state running. Our leadership was, separately in different locations. Would you say that our geostrategical location is the biggest challenge for us? Because in the end of the story, there was two big powers drawing new map in Tehran, Yalta, and is it from a historical point of view some kind of relations between very human orientation, as you mentioned here, and then science, and then finally strategy has no emotions, no morality, it's only space and power?
Yes, I know this is hugely emotive. This is actually, I mentioned this event that I did last week where there was kind of an argument in the audience. It was about Yalta, of course it was. So I absolutely understand why this is such an emotive issue for Poles. I think the interesting thing here is that there's a perception. I mean, the British attitude to all of this as a historical question. You know, if you went down the street in London and asked passers-by what Yalta is, they'd just look at you blankly. They would not have a clue.
Yep.
So it doesn't have any resonance. And I think even for people that read history books, it kind of doesn't have much resonance at all. But if you look back at it, there's a perception in the historiography, in the English language historiography, which comes up over and over again, which is that the British and the Americans are effectively, you know, hoodwinked by Stalin at Yalta. And in a way, that's a sort of an exculpatory lie. You know, it's sort of self-soothing narrative. Well, we couldn't have known, and there was this kind of arch, you know, like Putin, 3D chess player, and he just outplayed everybody, and what could we do, right? I can see where the narrative comes from, but unfortunately, it's just not true.
Yes, that's
The problem is with Yalta, from a British perspective, is that, you know, Churchill sees himself as, you know, his sphere of power, if you like, within the Grand Alliance, within the three, along with you know, Roosevelt and Stalin, is shrinking almost by the day. Okay, so his degree of influence over events is also shrinking, and you have Roosevelt, who is desperate to, you know, come to some arrangement with Stalin, believes that he can be Stalin's kind of best friend, and that might be the way forward. I mean, you could say maybe the same way like Trump and Putin at the moment.
Absolutely.
So he's going in a rather, you could say, naive way, like today, and is being taken for a ride. And Churchill is the one with eyes open saying, well, we knew already that the Russians were very untrustworthy, Soviets were very untrustworthy, were already, you know, spying on their allied partners and so on. And yet there's actually not much that Churchill could do. He did try to, you know, exercise whatever power he had. He tried to even play the sphere of influence game with the percentages agreement with Stalin. He tried to sort of play it in a way that Stalin would understand in terms of spheres of influence. Again, that didn't really work.
I think that, you know, I tried to do some research on, you know, different approaches between differences in approach between British and Americans on Yalta, and I fully agree that there was a gap between them. I mean, Churchill was not naive guy.
No.
He didn't believe what Stalin was saying. And he tried to convince Poles, Mikołajczyk, by the way, you know, a Polish prime minister in that time, to at least try to negotiate something. And there was the issue of Curzon Line, I mean, the Polish Eastern Territories, which was politically unacceptable to give up for Mikołajczyk. And that was a strategy, Polish strategy in that time. While Americans, well, that's interesting because they developed a kind of the narrative in 1946 that the Yalta Accords were okay, but then was violated by the Soviets. So the Soviets didn't stick to the word in 1945-46, while the Brits were simply much more or less skeptical from the very beginning about how this could fly. More realistic, perhaps, because the argument was what we can actually do. We don't have troops there. I mean, there are, you know, Soviets there.
And that's the thing. The only thing you could do was try and forge some agreement with Stalin, which, in the circumstances, even if he made the agreement, he was never going to stick to it.
So was Poland betrayed in Yalta, in your view?
It certainly looks like that. I think that the wider question is what could have been done differently. I think Churchill did try to some extent, but as I said, his ability to influence events is diminishing, almost daily. So in the same way as I sort of see 1939 as a qualified betrayal, a partial betrayal, I'd say the same thing about Yalta. Again, I think there's that, to come back to that sort of slightly neurotic Polish view, the idea that this was in some way a sort of conspiracy and just, Poland doesn't matter, let's just get rid of it. Yeah. Again, I think that's overblown. I think that it was certainly on Churchill's radar. Yep. That he had to try and get something for Poland, but he just couldn't, is the real. But I think you're right, to go back to your point about, Poland's position. You have to bear in mind, between Nazi Germany, which has its dreams of Lebensraum, which has Poland in the way of all of that, right? And then the other way round, from the Soviet perspective, the Soviets still smarting after, having lost at the end of the territory they'd lost at the end of the First World War. That's what the territorial concessions given in the Nazi-Soviet pact was all about, right? And they're still wanting to come west. I mean, the Russian mentality, going right back to Peter the Great and beyond, is always about going west, right? That's the ambition. A little-known episode that I wrote about in Devil's Alliance, which is Molotov's visit to Berlin in November 1940, which never gets talked about because it doesn't fit any of the narratives, right? Except when you're talking about that relationship. So he goes to Berlin to discuss basically like a Nazi-Soviet Pact Mark II, a redux. Because they've done all the things that they said they'd do in the first Nazi-Soviet Pact. So he goes to Berlin, has high-level talks, speaks to Ribbentrop, speaks to Hitler, and so on. And it's very interesting to look at the transcripts of those conversations, to look at what the Soviets are asking for, right? The Bosphorus, the Skagerrak and the Kattegat at the mouth of the Baltic, right? And the Germans are going, no, that's really not up for grabs. Why don't you go south? Go down and attack the British Raj. Go and wash the Red Army's boots in the Indian Ocean. Yep. So they're desperately trying to there's a complete mismatch in terms of strategic vision. And then, of course, those talks come to nothing. Within a month, Hitler's given the final order for Barbarossa the following summer. You could make the argument that that was always going to happen at some point, but it's interesting to look at what Molotov is asking for. And it's all Western Europe, right? It's all Western Europe targets, strategic targets. So that never goes away. So by the time that they're in a position in 1944-45 to essentially write their own ticket, because where Red Army boots are going to end up, they're going to blooming well keep, right? It's obviously Poland is stuck in front center in that list of ambitions as well. So yeah, Poland's strategic position, unfortunately, damned both ways.
Full of challenges.
Yeah.
Well, there is a kind of the micro history you devoted your last book about Polish contribution to the World War II. Focus. That's the thing I would like to introduce now. Paszporty życia. That's in these two books, I mean, Devil's Alliance and Poland 1939. One may say that's that's the big story. Big politics, big armies. There is a kind of a huge part of war effort described by you in these two books. But here is completely different thing. A small group of the Polish diplomats, in some unimportant from the point of view of world politics, town in Bern in Switzerland, they somehow elaborated something which was unprecedented. Why we decided to, that this kind of story maybe interested for the wider audience, particularly British leaders. What was interesting in this thing?
I think for a lot, and I've sort of rationalised this when I've been sort of presenting the book in the UK. It came out, I think, 18 months ago or so. For a lot of that work that I've done, whether looking at, even Berlin at War, the book before, Devil's Alliance as well, what sort of swirls around all of this, or sorry, put it the other way around, what at the center of a lot of these narratives that I've been dealing with and researching and writing about, kind of there's a black hole at the center of a lot of that, which was the Holocaust. And it was one of those subjects that I was kind of interested to try and address in a book, but I never wanted to do, just a sort of another synthesis about the Holocaust. I mean, that to me is frankly a bit boring. I mean, I am the one that I has to get up in the morning and go into my shed and write the book for sort of 2 years or 2.5 years or whatever it is. So I need to find an interesting angle that enables me to do that. So in the back of my mind, I had, I'd like to address the Holocaust at some point, but you have to find the right narrative that allows you to do that. And this arrived, and I think you were instrumental in it as well, Sławek. Actually, I think an approach came and said, this story is kind of breaking in Poland, and it was being discussed in the press and so on. This is going back probably to 2019, I think it was.
Yes.
And so I was sort of put in touch with some of the researchers at the Pilecki Institute who've been doing a lot of the sort of primary research. And so Jakub Kumok as well.
Polish ambassador to Switzerland.
Now, so yeah, it was then the ambassador to Switzerland, was in the same building in which this all took place, remarkably. So I was sort of put in touch with those people, and I sort of received a lot of the materials, and then it sort of came back, so what do you think? And I thought, no, this actually is it's a fascinating story in its own right, and was unknown. I mean, how often does something arrive on your lap that, it's especially something as significant and relevant as a narrative of Holocaust rescue, arrives on your lap, and it's unknown effectively. So I thought, this is fantastic. It does it also in the wider sense. It allows me to tell that, address the Holocaust in a book. So for me, it sort of ticked a lot of boxes, and that became effectively my COVID project. We all had a COVID project. That became my COVID project, and hugely serendipitously, because a lot of the primary research had been done. I received these sort of data dumps of archival documents, whether it's from Yad Vashem or from the US archives or from Bundesarchiv or the Swiss Bundesarchiv as well. I sort of received these data dumps of documents. And then I just, through COVID, I just sat in my shed and worked through them and sort of tried to piece together the story. And that's the result. And it is a fascinating story. And it actually, when you start working on these things, that very often it will take you in directions that you didn't expect, which is a normal part of the process. I think, intellectually, you have to be open enough to allow yourself to be taken where the material is taking you. Right. This is always my complaint with kind of, PhDs, which are really tightly, thesis-led, is that you're desperately trying to prove the thesis. And in a sense, there's a risk that you'll miss out all the other extraneous points which might lead you in another direction or even contradict the thesis entirely. So that, you have to be intellectually open enough to sort of see where the material goes. And with this one, what I found fascinating, which sort of feeds into the wider narrative of it, was international attitudes to the ongoing Holocaust. That became an essential part of the story, and this is where it feeds into Polish Underground as well. All of that the Polish Underground was absolutely central in getting the message that the Holocaust is happening. This is real. It's happening on the ground as we speak. Getting the information, collecting the information, in a sense, making sense of it, which wasn't easy, and then getting it out to London, which is even harder, right?
And
That
Washington
process,
then.
and Washington by extension, yeah. And then, of course, you've got, you know, the famous scene with Karski in Washington, and you know, being essentially told that he's not telling the truth because they can't possibly believe, you know, the essence of what he's saying. It's simply too big. It's simply too mind blowing. So all of that was an essential part of this. You know, how does the outside world take that message? How does it react? And then you've got an example like the Ładoś group in Bern, who are really not waiting around to be told what to do. They're not told to do that even by the Polish government in exile. They just do it, which I thought was fantastic. It's an amazing story. And they start already, you know, it's very organic. It's not like they all sit together and decide, right, this is what we're going to do. And it's very organic. It develops very organically. But by the time it's properly working, which is into really early 42 effectively, by the time it's properly working, it's a cottage industry, you know, producing mainly Paraguayan passports, which are then, it's ridiculous, isn't it? Which are then shipped in, and very often with couriers or even by post. They just sent them by post, again, mainly into you know, Warsaw Ghetto and other locations, mainly in occupied Poland. And the whole process of how that worked it's astonishing story. I mean, it should be a film. It really should be a feature film.
What were the reactions in United Kingdom on your book?
It went down pretty well. I mean, this is one example where what I tried to do, and the UK edition is called The Forgers, and the subtitle is, you know, the true story of the Holocaust's most, I think, audacious rescue attempt or something like that. It deliberately doesn't mention Poland, right? And I've seen other books do the same thing. So there was a book that's just come out in the UK, which is called The CIA Book Club, by a chap called Charlie English. And I'm reading it at the moment. It's very, very good. And it's basically about the CIA operation to smuggle banned literature into Poland in the 1980s, the 1970s and 80s, right? Which then becomes sort of samizdat and all of that, you know, with the solidarity underground. Fascinating story. About 80% of that book is basically Polish 1970s, 1980s history. Again, it doesn't mention Poland on the cover. So I think that's deliberate, as it was certainly deliberate with mine, because I think we're going back to what we said earlier on, that you've got your reader in the bookshop who's going through the shelves and says, oh, that's about Poland, you know, because it's sort of off their mental map. But if you can get them to read a book, they might read a book about the Holocaust, particularly about a Holocaust rescue operation. They might read a book about the CIA. And by the time they've realized that actually 80% of this book is about Poland, and in my case, 100% of the book is about Poland, it's too late. They're already hooked. You know, they're already into the narrative. And it's about trying to, as I said before, you know, trying to reach out and bring those readers that wouldn't necessarily pick up a book about Poland and bring them into that world. And then hopefully the next time they see a book about Poland, they'll pick it up. So it's an interesting, you know, the way I sort of marketed it was, and I got some stick for that. I got some criticism for that online, particularly. Oh, why didn't you mention Poland on the cover? And I thought, well, it is a deliberate thing. We want as many people to read it as possible. I'm not playing down the Polishness of this story, not in the inside pages at all. But this is a way to try and bring more people in to read the book, and that's got to be win-win, right? But it went well. It went well in the US as well. The US one, unfortunately, came out, I think it was pretty much the same week as the Hamas raid on Israel in October. That October of whenever it was, 23.
October
7th, yeah.
7th of October.
So that was, so, you know, America was going through a kind of weird spasm, as you've seen on university campuses, you know, weird spasm of anti-Semitism at the time. And so I think it was perhaps a victim of those circumstances at the time. The great horror you have as an author, aside from that, is that your book comes out the same week as a momentous event, because essentially the world and, you know, by extension, the media, they're all looking in the other direction. And, you know, you don't get any coverage, you don't get any reviews or anything, because everyone's going, oh my God, what's happening over there? So that, you know, in a sense, I suppose that was part of the problem in the US as well. But I think it went well, and again, it's getting the word out there. And the last point from me on that is that what came across very strongly to me in the research, in the writing of that book, is how correct, and I would say even exemplary, the behavior of the Polish government in exile was in this question. Because as we know, Poland gets a bad rep with regard to the Holocaust and who did what and why didn't they do more and all this sort of thing. And in this example, I think the Polish government in exile behaved exemplarily in its treatment of that issue. When it realized what the guys in Bern were doing, it got fully behind it. Yep. It sent funds. It did everything possible to help them carry on doing what they were doing. They were shut down by the Swiss police, incidentally. And the Polish government in exile did everything it could to publicize the action in the outside world as well, to try and move, you know, the US, Paraguayans as well, because it was their passports that had been illegally issued. So they did everything possible to support that action and behaved, I think, exemplarily, really.
Very important and touched me very much was nobody else tried to do that way.
Yeah.
Which was pretty significant.
Yeah.
Well, so would you say that history matters? History still matters? Because today it looks like, you know, just only social media and most.
Yeah, I know that.
Here we see it matters.
Yeah, of course. You know, there's
dynamic process.
There's easy answers to that question, and then there's more complicated answers.
Yeah.
I mean, I do history because I'm fascinated by it, right? So it's just a fascination, and this is the period and the sort of geographical area that I've landed on because of my background and my training and all of that. In another parallel universe, it could have been 13th century France. I don't know, but this is where we are. But I do it because I find it fascinating, and I want to tell those stories, and I want to make my readers go, "Oh my God, that's amazing!" What kind of, in a sense, annoys me often. I'm not often annoyed. No, I'll ask my wife. I am often annoyed. But what annoys me often is this sort of utilitarian history, which is, it's too often presented, I don't know how it is in Poland, but certainly in the UK, in terms of history education in schools. It's all about the lessons of history, right? What history teaches us about the present, what history teaches about what we should do now, how we should behave now, all this sort of thing. And okay, I mean, there are some lessons to be learned in anything, but the problem with all of that is that history never repeats itself, right? It's not a situation where you can say, well, in 1939 they did this, so that's what we should do now. If anyone's seriously saying that, they're stupid. Okay? There are echoes and there are parallels that you can draw out, but you know that can be vaguely useful as a sort of a historical parlor game. But there's not really any sort of concrete lessons that you can learn because the circumstances are always different, right? Beyond, pretty broad brush stuff, like, if you look at Russian behavior now versus Russian behavior then, or Soviet behavior then, there's not that much, in essence, there's not that much difference, right? It's a sort of view of the outside world as, inveterately hostile, to be played off against one another, to be hoodwinked. So all of that, there's that similarity. So that helps.
Yeah, but you cannot say exactly that what we see in a negotiation table right now is Yalta 2-0.
No, exactly. You can't do that. So yeah, absolutely. And knowledge, knowledge of history has a role to play. I mean, it's this last week. It's been astonishing to see, Trump's negotiator with Putin have, as far as we can tell from what's been reported, precisely no knowledge, either of the history or of the area that he's supposed to be negotiating about. Right? He could do with reading a few history books, I suggest. So yeah, okay, there's a role for it there. But this idea of just learning the lessons of history, I find it all slightly irritating, because for me it's fascinating in its own right, without necessarily having to draw these big, conclusions out of it.
I would like to introduce yet another subject for our conversation. I mean, books are important. We love write them and read them, but what in the general public, but the source from general public learns about history nowadays is cinema. So we all
And Netflix.
Netflix, YouTube, everything. So I have a question to both of you now. What's your best World War II movie? Raymond, perhaps you have your own three
Well,
top
I cannot tell you.
movies which actually shape the way you understand the
It will be politically risky if I say that Czterech Pancernych i Pies was the most, four tankers and dock. But that was inspiration, the reason I really became a tanker. But we have many good movies. It depends on what you really want to study. Is about quality of, performance of actors or historical context. I think the Band of Brothers that we discussed is a pretty good movie about the sense of leadership, of feeling of being part of the team. It's about the ethos, about your dedication to duty. So definitely, Band of Brothers will be one of them, and of course, because I love the cavalry. So all of the movies about the cavalry would be my favorite.
So you didn't mention Fury.
Fury is well, for tankers. we have some objections.
I have a soft spot always, I have to say, and again, this is quite controversial. I think Saving Private Ryan is a fantastic film.
Yeah, Private Ryan.
You can query, how realistic the narrative is, essentially, but in terms of how it's shot, how it was made, characterization is brilliant. That's what we want from film. It's the same, in a sense, it's the same as a history book. Is that you want to be drawn into that world and understand those people and care about them, right? And that's all within the filmmaker's art. And this is one of the things that I think modern films all too often, because we can do pretty much everything by CGI, modern filmmakers, with few exceptions, have kind of forgotten the old-fashioned arts of storytelling and characterization. And it's actually that stuff that drags people in. And that's what makes people go, that was a brilliant film. Like, it makes you cry at the end. If you don't care, you're not invested. But if a good film can make you care in the same way as a good history book can. And that's a film that really does, bring a lump to the throat at the end, and the narrative is strong, the characterizations are strong. So I'm a big fan of that. But also, I agree with Band of Brothers as well.
So there is, of course, a particular idea behind this question, because I would like to, again, bring our conversation to the Polish issues. There are two movies which actually popularized the Polish role in the World War II. One Bridge Too Far, when we had General Sosabowski, definitely, wonderfully played by one of the best of the time American actors, and Battle of Britain, of course.
You mean the previous one, the first one?
The first one,
Yeah.
absolutely. The first. I mean, there was only one good one. But so
Real Spitfires flying. Yeah.
So again, I mean, the roles of Polish pilots were actually very well presented in this movie. So these two somehow reintroduced Poles to the public consciousness.
Yeah.
Are there any missing or forgotten battles that should be filmed when the Poles played a significant role, in your view?
Ooh, that's a good question. That's a very good question. I mean, I'd love to see. I'd love, of course, I would love to see some sort of filmic representation of September '39. That would be good. And there's so much material there as well to actually go into. And we had that.
Battle of Croyante, or
Yeah, I mean, I would say not necessarily just focusing on one particular battle, but actually maybe taking, a character, either, real life or a fictional one, and sort of carrying through, you've only got to do 5 weeks and a bit either side, and carrying that through what they experience.
So something like Dunkirk.
Yeah, in the same kind of way. So I think that that's something I would love to see, and again, it would, not for selfish reasons, but it would cement September '39 as an essential part of the wartime narrative to the outside world. So that, I think, would go quite well.
from my perspective, definitely the good movie about General Maciek. It was as a human being, as a commander, and before war, and in 1939, when he commanded, cavalry brigade, then France and Britain, and then post-war, period of time. It will be absolutely fascinating movie with the, including the Normandy battles. So, well.
Can I ask you guys a question?
Yeah, sure.
You've come back a couple of times. You've come back to Maciek. You were talking about, Battle of Britain and Sosabowski and the Bridge Too Far. They're all on the Polish army in the West, and that's where your focus is from those choices, right? How is that viewed? How were those characters and those narratives viewed for you two, kind of growing up as in Poland, in people's Poland? Was that a sort of exotic, could that almost have been on the moon in a way?
Definitely.
It was miles away, and it was an exotic narrative, or what was it?
Yeah, remember when the Anders was, introduced in a different way at that time. So completely, the Russian propaganda, the communist propaganda at that time presented, completely different way. There was only, First and Second Army, in the eastern direction, liberators.
Yeah.
And all of those movies and also books were completely, West-oriented. So there was not...
So was it almost like a sort of a forbidden narrative?
I remember first time when I was a student in the military academy, there was a, I think, illegal issue of a book of John Anders bez ostatniego rozdziału. Yeah. And then there was also Monte Cassino by Kovich. I was completely shocked when I was, reading, new version of history, and it happened yesterday. So history is a dynamic process.
Yeah.
I think that there's it did exist in the kind of the public, let's say, public awareness. First of all, it was a big contribution. So, majority of the Polish troops, of course, stayed in the United Kingdom, in South Africa, everywhere, and they were not. They simply couldn't come back to Poland. But some of them, of course, came to Poland. Skalski, by the way. So, just mention one, a Polish famous Battle of Britain pilot. So it was present. I think that people were interested to learn more about it. I mean, Monte Cassino definitely was even during the communist time. So a battle highly popularized and well told because of Wańkowicz, of course, because of the others. So it was present. I think that coming back to the more wide story, which battles, which Polish contribution to the World War II should be popularized in the West. Definitely, still Monte Cassino is the subject which should be told once again in better way. I would say the Polish salesman. I mean, there is the Polish Navy it's a big story. It's not only submarines we have. or we had a good movie about Orzo.
Yeah. Well, that's a story that deserves a bigger airing, you know.
Exactly.
So if Hollywood picks that one up, I'll be very happy.
Yeah, that's a big story. Tobruk, definitely. That's another thing. I think there is a very good Czech movie about Tobruk battle. When, of course, focus on the Czechs and Czechoslovaks generally fighting them. But comparing to Czechoslovak, with all due respect, the Polish contribution was much more significant. And there is absolutely no, let's say, good story about that in the movie world.
Yeah. I would go back as well. I think there was one film that is worth mentioning. I'm trying to think of the proper title for it. Was it The Long Walk Home or The Long Road Home? It actually had Colin Farrell in it, which sounds like he was hopelessly miscast. But he was playing, I think, a Pole who'd been either escaped from or released from the Gulag, and was making his way down to Anders in Central Asia, right?
Yeah.
I think he was going, but that narrative, I know it's peripheral to, you know, strictly military stories, but that narrative, the whole, you know, Polish deportations, then Anders and so on, that needs to be much better known.
At the backstage, we discussed Vajda's cutting, because and we raised, so, you know, just to share with the wider audience what we have already talked about it. We discussed the way how the movie was done, was shot, actually, and I think that the issue was
Who was the target?
who was the target?
Target
Who was
audience, yeah.
Who was the audience in his mind? Because I think for Poles, it was a very important movie.
Yeah.
Because it was a kind of a monument
Of course.
to those who were executed by the Soviets then. But for world audience, it was a story. So how it was in your view?
Complicated, I think.
It was complicated, and I think for an outside audience that, you know, perhaps either didn't know anything about the Katyn story or just knew the very, very basics, the problem you had with that story, and I think it's a fabulous film. I mean, it's right up there in my top 10. But, you know, I understand the background, I understand the story reasonably well, and so on. I think if you're coming to that story in that film cold, without the background knowledge, you would be slightly baffled. Why exactly why are these guys being taken out and shot? We know, and part of the problem here is what we were saying earlier about, you know, who is the target audience. I completely understand that, you know, for Vajda himself and for the Polish audience, this absolutely had to be made because it's so central to the Polish view of themselves, of their martyrdom in the Second World War. It's absolutely, you know, the central totemic experience, right? Completely get that. But in terms of trying to communicate that story to those that don't know that, the film is dropping too many references left, right, and centre, which Poles
only
get.
for Poles.
Yeah, Poles get all of that, and they, oh, he's mentioned that, he's mentioned this. You know, all of those all those references that he drops have a tremendous resonance for Poles. For the outside world, you're just left with something that's slightly confusing, and you don't quite know what's going on. So I think there must ideally there can be a middle ground between the two positions. That's not to say that for the outside world it was a bad film, because it wasn't. It was brilliant, but I think it was too dense, is what I would say. There was too much going on. There were too many references being dropped.
Many stories.
Yeah, and essentially, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, so it sounds like a gentleman that there's some room for improvements. How to read the books, and also how to write the books. So history is a very much dynamic process, which, you know, goes to the point that we never expected to be. And I think, luckily, we have a gentleman who supports those processes, especially translating very romantic Polish approach to history into British and not only audience. So it's you're doing very great job, and
Thank you.
we really appreciate what you're doing. How about your next efforts of give us some
This is where
flavor.
I use my Polish audience. As I said before, I sort of straddle a bit Polish history with German history. So I wrote 2 books on German history before I wrote Devil's Alliance. And then I've had a block of 3, which is these 3 here, on Polish history. So the next book, which is coming out in October in the UK and US, is on the U-boat war in World War II.
Das Boot.
I mean, my elevator pitch was essentially, this is Das Boot, the history book, right? Das Boot is another one, actually, we're talking about cinema, that had you pressed me for another title, I would have given Das Boot. Because, again, it's about characterization, to be able to drag the viewer in to that world and make you sympathize with German submariners in everything that they're going through is an astonishing achievement in cinematographic terms. So it is essentially Das Boot, the history book. It's flipping the conventional perspective. There's quite a lot has been written on the U-boat war, the Battle of the Atlantic, particularly in the English-speaking narrative. But if you imagine how that conventionally goes, it's resolutely written from the point of view of the destroyer, the merchantman, from the perspective of the surface. And the U-boat itself is very often literally and metaphorically unseen. Yep. We know nothing about them. We don't know who they are. We don't know which U-boat it was. We don't know what they've been through.
Periscope perspective.
So this is flipping that perspective by 180 degrees and trying to tell the story of the U-boat war from their perspective, effectively, using a lot of archival material, a lot of these Kriegstagebücher, the war diaries. There's a wealth of material actually in German that doesn't really sort of tend to get dragged across into the standard narratives of the Battle of the Atlantic. So, and again, it's been fascinating. It's been a really interesting experience to write it. And you're left slightly bizarrely for me, because a lot of the stuff I've been writing about, centers on Central Europe, Polish experience in World War II, unbelievably brutal. The German method of war in the East is unbelievably brutal, as we all know, right? One of the arguments I always have is that there's an Eastern way of war for the Germans and there's a Western way of war. And the Western way of war, in Scandinavia and in France and the Low Countries, for example, is very, very different. It's much gentler. It still could be brutal, but generally it's much gentler. So coming from that sort of Central European perspective where, it is a world of perpetrators, effectively, and then you look at the Battle of the Atlantic and it is inherently brutal. It's still warfare. They're still sinking, British merchantmen. 30,000 British and Allied sailors die in the process. But it's remarkably clean. There's the number of atrocities that are committed by the U-boat force, you can count on one hand.
Yeah.
Which is quite astonishing. I hadn't assumed that would be the case. I thought I'd find more. It's quite possible that, they've disappeared. They're lost to history. They did happen. They've been lost to history. But it's quite remarkable how clean that particular theatre was. So that's an interesting lesson for me from that. Don't necessarily go in with prejudicial assumptions.
So it was a kind of yet another myth. So in general Western Europe perception, the World War II looked like the one in Belgium, in Netherlands, in France. And of course, the German or the Third Reich war against the Soviet Union was somehow delivered to the Western audience also by a Soviet documentary, which was quite widely seen in the Western world. But the way how brutal Germans were here, and in Ukraine, and in Belarus, I think it's still untold story to some extent.
Yeah. And it's one of those things that I still bring up all the time. The Eastern War and the Western War, they're two different conflicts to a large extent in terms of, how they treat, civilian populations, how they treat, captured and injured soldiers. And an interesting point that I always bring out, if you look at, in the French experience, you look at Oradour, for example, the massacre at Oradour. I always describe it, it's an eruption of the Eastern War in the West. Right? Because Das Reich had just been transferred from the Eastern Front. That's how you do things on the Eastern Front. If you get shot at, if there's trouble, you go and raise the village. You destroy the whole village and you kill everybody.
Yep.
So this was an eruption of the Eastern War in the West. And I think when you tell it like that, people go, okay, now we kind of get what you're doing, what you're talking about. That the experience of the war, Poland, Ukraine, Belarus, for example, was that every other village was an Oradour, right? That's the reality. And when you describe it in those terms, you can certainly bring it home to French readers that's how things were, and that brings the difference home.
So, Roger, thank you very much for being with us. Thank you very much for bringing a Polish piece in World War II to the wider audience. You are very effective in that. So we are wishing you all successes in continuation of this. What's your next Polish book?
As I said, I would love to do something on the Polish underground. I think that, the story of the Polish underground is fascinating.
So you're sitting in the proper place.
I am, exactly. I would love to do that. I mean, there many a slip twixt cup and lip, as Shakespeare once said. So, there's lots of things to be overcome, publishers, agents, and so on. But that certainly is on my list.
Please do so. They will be highly recommended as the...
And it would fit nicely on top of that pile.
Yeah.
Best wishes. Best wishes. Szanowni Państwo, bardzo dziękujemy za uwagę. Mamy nadzieję, że zachęciliśmy do lektury książek Rogera Murhausa, a także do refleksji na temat tego, w jaki sposób opowiadać o polskiej historii szerszej publiczności, jakie filmy powinniśmy nakręcić dla szerszej publiczności, a może także dla nas samych trochę.
Troszkę da.
Dziękujemy za uwagę. Zapraszamy na kolejny odcinek Ground Zero.
Dziękujemy.
Siła, forma, dyscyplina. Białko, kreatynę i kolagen marki All Nutrition znajdziesz w sklepie SFD. Z kodem 0 zgarnij 10% rabatu.
Partnerem programu jest aplikacja inwestycyjna XTB. XTB. Tu pracują Twoje pieniądze.
Kliknij w jeden z polecanych filmów, aby obejrzeć najlepsze produkcje kanału Zero.